Good evening, night creatures. We continue on to traverse into the story of Coeus, the Titan of Intellect and the Celestial Axis. Prologue. The God nobody tells you about. There is a Titan whose name you almost certainly do not know. Not Cronus, who swallowed his children and became the image of devouring time. Not Oceanus, who encircled the world in his river embrace. Not Hyperion, who fathered the sun and moon and dawn. Not Prometheus, who stole fire and suffered for it. Not Atlas, who holds the sky on his shoulders. Coeus. He is the Titan of the inquiring mind, the divine principle of the questioning intelligence, of the intellect that reaches outward toward the unknown, that is constitutionally oriented toward what is not yet known rather than what already is. The Titan whose name is connected, in ancient etymological analysis, to the verb meaning to perceive, to question, to inquire. The divine being whose nature was the orientation of intelligence toward the not yet understood. He is also, most immediately, the grandfather of Apollo and Artemis. Through his daughter Leto, the gentle Titaness who bore the twin divine children of Zeus in one of the mythology's most extended and most poignant birth stories. Coeus was the ancestor of two of the most important and most fully developed of all the Olympian deities, the god of light and reason and prophecy, and the goddess of the hunt and the moon and the wild. Both trace their divine lineage through a Titan most people have never heard of. This invisibility, this being the background of the most visible, was, as this story will argue, not incidental to Coeus's character, but essential to it. The inquiring intelligence is not itself the thing it inquires about. The question is not the answer. The mind reaching toward understanding is not the understanding it reaches toward. Coeus was the divine principle of the reach itself, the orientation of the intelligence toward what it does not yet know. And like all orientations, like all directional principles, he was defined by what he pointed toward, rather than by what he himself constituted. He pointed toward knowledge. He was not knowledge itself. His brother Titan Mnemosyne was memory, which is knowledge preserved, and his wife Phoebe was associated with prophetic knowledge, which is knowledge anticipated. Coeus was the reaching, the asking, the fundamental intellectual posture of the mind that moves toward what it does not know, because it cannot rest in not knowing. This is a small domain in the mythology's terms. He has few direct episodes. He has no dramatic myths that bear his name. He did not have an extended cult. He is not the subject of Homeric hymns or Pindaric odes. And yet the principle he represents, the inquiring intelligence, the mind constitutionally oriented toward the unknown, is one of the most important principles in the entire human story. And it appears with extraordinary density in his descendants. Apollo, who spoke the oracles at Delphi, who was the god of the rational light that illuminated what had been obscure, who governed the transition from darkness to comprehension, was Coeus's grandson. The oracular tradition itself, the ancient world's most developed institution for the formal pursuit of knowledge about the unknown, descended from the Titan, whose name meant the inquiring mind. To understand Coeus is to understand something about the intellectual tradition that the Greeks created and that we have inherited. It is to understand the mythological grounding of one of the most important human capacities. The capacity to ask questions, to orient oneself toward the unknown, to refuse the comfort of not knowing and reach instead toward the light of the not yet known. This is his story. It is, in an important sense, the story of the question itself. The nature of the inquiring mind. Part 1. The Cosmological Position. Chapter 1. The Forgotten Elder. He was born of Uranus and Gaia, in the primordial age before the divine generations had sorted themselves into the organized hierarchies of the Olympian order. He was among the 12 Titans, the first generation of named divine beings, the children of sky and earth, each one a fundamental principle of the world given divine form. The 12 Titans were Oceanus and Tethys, the world river and the underground waters, Hyperion and Thea, the above light and the shiningness, Cronus and Rhea, the harvest time and the earth mother, Themis and Mnemosyne, divine lore and memory, Iapetus, the peer or the wound, whose children would include Prometheus and Atlas, Coeus, associated with the constellations, and Coeus and Phoebe, the inquiring mind and the bright oracular intelligence. The pairing was not arbitrary. Coeus and Phoebe were husband and wife, sister and brother, as all the primordial Titan couples were, and their complementarity was the complementarity of two aspects of the intelligence as it related to knowledge. Coeus as the orientation of intelligence toward what is not yet known, the reaching posture of the inquiring mind. Phoebe as the brightness of the intelligence that had arrived at knowledge, particularly the prophetic knowledge of what was to come. Together they constituted the complete arc of the intellectual act, the reaching toward the unknown, Coeus, and the illumination that arrived when the reaching succeeded, Phoebe. The question and the answer, the inquiry and the oracle, the orientation toward the not yet known, and the bright clarity of the known. Among the 12 Titans, he occupied a position that was both central and invisible. Central because the intelligence that reaches toward the unknown was among the most fundamental principles of the Greek understanding of what made the cosmos meaningful, invisible, because the reaching was never itself the thing reached for. The inquiry was never itself the knowledge inquired after. He was among the most abstract of the Titans, which contributed to his narrative invisibility. Oceanus had his river to personify. Hyperion had his children's brilliant solar journeys. Cronus had his terrible, vivid acts of consumption and defeat. Even Mnemosyne had the Muses, the 9 daughters who were the specific expressions of the memory principle in the arts and sciences. Coeus had his quality, the reaching of the intelligence toward the unknown, expressed most vividly, not in his own mythology, but in the mythology of his descendants. He was the grandfather of the god who answered questions, the principle of the question itself. Chapter 2. What his name meant. The etymology of Coeus was the subject of ancient analysis and modern scholarly discussion, and the most consistent thread in that analysis connected his name to the Greek verb koio, or to related forms meaning to perceive, to observe, to question, to exercise the faculty of the inquiring intelligence on the world. This etymological connection was not merely interesting as a curiosity about divine naming conventions. In the Greek tradition, divine names were compressed cosmological statements, names that described the being's nature, that were essentially definitional of what the divine being was in its fundamental character. To know a divine being's name, in the Greek religious imagination, was to know something essential about that being's nature, its function in the cosmos, its relationship to the principles it embodied. If Coeus's name connected to the inquiring, perceiving intelligence, to the faculty of the mind that reached toward what it did not yet know, then his name was his nature, and his nature was the inquiry itself. He was the divine being of the reaching intelligence, the Titan whose fundamental character was the orientation of consciousness toward the not yet known. The ancient commentators who noted these etymological connections were participating in a much older tradition of divine name interpretation that went back to the earliest periods of Greek religious thought. The name was the key to the divine nature, and the key Coeus's name offered was the key of the intellectual orientation, the posture of the mind that reaches outward, that faces the unknown, that is constitutionally oriented toward what it does not yet understand. The Theogony's various commentaries offered additional perspective. Coeus was associated with the north in some ancient astrological and elemental traditions, the north being the direction of the cold and the dark, the direction least hospitable to life and settlement, the direction that faced away from the sun's warmth toward the unknown that lay beyond the habitable world. The north, as the direction of the unknowing, was an appropriate domain for the Titan of the inquiring mind. The mind faced the direction of the not yet known, and the not yet known was associated with the cold dark of the northern unknown. Chapter 3. The Marriage to Phoebe. He married Phoebe, the bright one, the luminous, the Titaness, whose nature was associated with the prophetic oracle's brightness, and whose name shared its root with the word phos, light. She was among the most significant of the Titanesses, the holder of the Delphic oracle before it was passed to her grandson Apollo, the bright intelligence that had sat at the world's navel and answered the questions of those who came seeking knowledge. The marriage between Coeus and Phoebe was the marriage between the question and its oracular answer, between the reaching intelligence and the bright knowing that the reaching eventually arrived at. He was the orientation toward the unknown. She was the luminous intelligence that the unknown gave way to when the inquiry succeeded. Phoebe's association with the oracle at Delphi was one of the most significant elements of her mythology. In Hesiod's account, and in later elaborations of the Delphic tradition, the oracle had passed through several divine custodians before it came to Apollo. First Gaia held it, then Themis, then Phoebe, then Apollo, who received it as a birthday gift from his grandmother when he was born. This genealogy of the Delphic oracle's custodianship, passing from Phoebe to her grandson Apollo, was not merely a genealogical convenience. It was the tradition's account of how the capacity for answering humanity's questions had developed through the divine generations. From the earth itself, Gaia, the oldest wisdom, through divine law and necessity, Themis, through the bright titanic intelligence, Phoebe, to the organized, rational, musically ordered intelligence of the Olympian, Apollo. And behind Phoebe, behind the bright intelligence that held the oracle, was Coeus, the inquiry that the oracle answered, the question that the oracle's existence presupposed. The oracle existed because beings asked questions. Phoebe held the oracle because she was the bright knowing that answered questions. And Coeus was the divine principle that questions were asked at all. The fundamental intellectual orientation toward the unknown that made the entire oracular tradition necessary and possible. He was the oracle's grandfather in both the genealogical and the functional sense. The inquiry preceded the answer, and he was the divine principle of the inquiry. Chapter 4. The Axis of the World. Among the ancient traditions about Coeus was a specific cosmological association. He was connected to the axis of the world, the pole around which the celestial sphere appeared to rotate, the cosmic axle that maintained the structure of the heavens in their organized motion. The world axis. The axis mundi, in the later Latin expression of this nearly universal religious concept, was one of the most fundamental cosmological symbols in the ancient world. Every tradition that thought carefully about the structure of the cosmos identified something that corresponded to the axis. The tree Yggdrasil in the Norse tradition, the sacred mountain in Mesopotamian and Hindu thought, the omphalos at Delphi in the Greek tradition, the pillar that connected the above and the below in Egyptian cosmology. The axis was the thing around which everything else turned, the stable center, relative to which all the motion of the celestial bodies was organized and meaningful. Without the axis, there was no organized cosmic motion, only undifferentiated spinning. With the axis, the spinning became a pattern, a rhythm, a structure within which time and season and the cosmic order could be understood. Coeus's association with this axis was cosmologically appropriate. The inquiring intelligence was itself a kind of axis, the stable orientation around which the reaching toward knowledge was organized. The mind that inquired had a direction, a stable vector of reaching toward the not yet known, and this directional stability was analogous to the cosmic axis's function of providing the stable center around which the celestial motion was organized. He was, in this reading, the axis of the intellectual cosmos, the stable orientation of the inquiring mind that provided the directionality around which knowledge could be organized and accumulated. Without this axial orientation, without the fundamental posture of the intelligence reaching toward what it did not know, there was no knowledge, only the random reception of stimuli without the organizing structure that inquiry provided. Chapter 5. The North and the Unknown. The ancient astrological and elemental tradition that associated Coeus with the North, with the cold, dark, unknown direction that faced away from the sun's warmth, deserves more extended consideration than it usually receives, because it illuminated something essential about the relationship between the inquiring mind and the unknown. It was constitutionally oriented toward. The north, in the Greek geographical imagination, was the direction of the most extreme cold, the direction from which the bitter winter winds came, the direction beyond which the Hyperboreans lived, the legendary people who lived beyond the north wind, in a paradise so far north that the ordinary rules of the world didn't apply to them. The north was the direction of the extreme, the unknown, the beyond the ordinary world. Apollo himself was connected to the north through the Hyperborean tradition. He was said to spend the winter months among the Hyperboreans, leaving the Greek world and its oracles silent during the cold months, returning in spring when the Pythia could again prophesy. This seasonal absence and return, the divine knowledge withdrawing to the north in winter and returning in spring, was the mythological expression of the oracle's seasonal rhythm, the divine intelligence's relationship with the cold northern unknown. As Apollo's grandfather through Leto, Coeus was the ancestral connection between the inquiring intelligence and the northern unknown that the oracle periodically retreated into. The inquiry facing the north, facing the unknown, the cold, the direction of the not yet known, was the fundamental posture of the Coeus principle. And this posture was transmitted through the genealogical line to the grandchildren whose mythological lives were most thoroughly organized around the capacity to illuminate what had been dark, to answer what had been asked. Part 2. The Children of the Inquiry. Chapter 6. Leto, the gentlest of the Titans. Coeus and Phoebe had 2 daughters. The first was Leto, whose name was connected to ancient words for the hidden, the night, the concealed. And she was among the most significant and most beloved of all the Titanesses in the Greek tradition. Leto was gentle. This was her most consistent characterization across the ancient sources, a quality remarkable enough to be worth dwelling on, because the divine world of the Greek imagination was not, by and large, characterized by gentleness. The Olympians were powerful and passionate, and capable of tremendous generosity and tremendous cruelty, but gentle was not the word most often used of them. Leto was gentle, mild, sweet-tempered, the one divine being whom even the other gods found it difficult not to love. This gentleness was the specific quality of Coeus's daughter, the personality expression of the inquiring mind's most fundamental virtue. The mind that is genuinely oriented toward what it does not know must be, in some essential sense, gentle, must approach the unknown without the arrogance of the already knowing, must reach toward the not yet understood with the openness that allows the understanding to arrive rather than the certainty that prevents it. The genuine inquirer's epistemic humility expressed itself in Leto's divine character as the gentleness that made her universally beloved. She became the mother of Apollo and Artemis, the twin divine children she bore to Zeus, in a pregnancy and birth that became one of the mythology's most extended and most poignant episodes. Her path to bringing these children into the world was among the most difficult of any divine birth in the tradition, and the difficulty was directly connected to the jealousy of Hera, Zeus's wife, whose rage at her husband's affair with the gentle Titaness expressed itself in a persecution that traced the entire geography of the Greek world. Chapter 7. The Wandering of Leto. When Leto became pregnant by Zeus, Hera's jealousy was immediate and comprehensive. She forbade any land to give Leto a place to rest and give birth, a prohibition of extraordinary scope, essentially exiling the pregnant Titaness from the entire inhabited world, denying her the earth's own hospitality in her most vulnerable hour. The prohibition worked because of how the ancient world understood the relationship between divine authority and geographical space. Hera's command carried force over the lands of the earth, and each potential refuge that Leto approached refused her out of fear of Hera's wrath. The mythology preserved in Callimachus's hymn to Delos and in the Homeric hymn to Apollo traced this wandering with the specificity of a geographical catalogue. Coeus's daughter walked from land to land, from island to island, carrying the divine children in her womb and finding nowhere to rest. This wandering, the pregnant Titaness seeking a place to give birth while the world refused her, was the most dramatic narrative expression of Coeus's lineage in the entire mythological tradition. The daughter of the inquiring mind was herself engaged in the most fundamental of all inquiries, the search for the place where new life could come into the world, where the not yet born could become the born, where potential could become actual. The wandering had a specifically intellectual quality in the tradition's telling. Leto did not simply suffer passively. She asked, she sought, she moved through the world with the orientation of someone who knew there was an answer and who would not stop looking until she found it. This was the Coeus quality in its human, or divine, expression, the refusal to accept the unknown as the permanent condition, the insistence on continued seeking until the seeking found its resolution. Chapter 8. Delos, the island that said yes. The resolution came from an unexpected direction, as the answers to the most urgent questions often do. The floating island of Delos, an island that, unlike the fixed lands of the earth, was not bound by Hera's prohibition because it was not truly land in the fixed sense, accepted Leto. This was the answer that the wandering had been seeking, not a great land or a famous harbor or a rich and powerful city, but a small, floating, barely there island that was more nearly water than land, that occupied the space between the fixed and the unfixed. That was itself a kind of question. Was it land? Was it sea? Did it belong to the world or to the ocean? Receiving the daughter of the inquiring mind, Delos promised to become a sanctuary, to become the fixed, stable center of a great cult of the divine children who would be born there. In exchange for accepting Leto, Delos would become the most sacred island in the Aegean, the birthplace of Apollo and Artemis, the center of one of the most important religious traditions in the ancient Greek world. This exchange, hospitality offered to the wandering seeker, greatness received in return, was mythologically and morally significant. The small and uncertain island that was willing to receive what the great and certain lands had refused received. As a consequence, a greatness exceeding all of them. This was the mythology's expression of a principle that runs through many of the world's wisdom traditions. The openness that can receive the unexpected is greater than the certainty that can only receive what it already expects. Delos, in accepting Leto, was displaying the same fundamental quality that Coeus embodied as a cosmic principle. The orientation toward the not yet known, the willingness to receive what was not anticipated, the intellectual openness that was the precondition of the genuinely new arriving. Chapter 9. The birth of Apollo and Artemis. The birth itself was extraordinary, in the mythology's telling. A labor of 9 days and 9 nights before Artemis arrived, and then Apollo, in the most prolonged and most difficult of all the divine births in the tradition. The difficulty had a specific cause, beyond the general hardship of Leto's wandering. Hera had detained Eileithyia, the goddess of childbirth, preventing her from attending Leto. Without Eileithyia's divine assistance, the labor could not progress. The other goddesses who had gathered on Delos to witness the birth of Zeus's children sent Iris to fetch Eileithyia, offering her a magnificent necklace in exchange for defying Hera's command and coming to Leto's aid. When Eileithyia arrived, the birth proceeded. Artemis came first, and in some tellings of the story, the newly born goddess immediately assisted in her twin brother's birth, becoming in the very first moments of her existence the helper in childbirth that she would be honored as throughout the subsequent tradition. Apollo was born second, beneath the palm tree on Delos, in a flooding of light that the mythology described as a shining of gold through the entire island. The light-bringer's arrival announced by the light itself. The golden flooding of the island at Apollo's birth was the moment when the principle of the inquiry arrived at the principle of the answer, when Coeus's lineage, the reaching toward the unknown, and Phoebe's lineage, the bright intelligence of the oracle, combined in the single divine birth that was the mythology's most concentrated expression of what the Titan grandparents had represented at the cosmological level. Apollo was born golden because the answer was always golden, because the illumination that arrived when the inquiry reached its goal had the quality of the sun's light, the above brightness that made the previously dark visible. He was the inquiry's answer, the question's resolution, the Coeus principle arriving at its destination. Chapter 10. Asteria, the other daughter. The second daughter of Coeus and Phoebe was Asteria, the starry one, the titaness of falling stars and shooting stars, of nocturnal oracles and star divination, and the oniric mode of prophetic knowledge that came in dreams and nighttime visions. Asteria was less familiar than her sister Leto, less narratively prominent, but her mythological history was in its own way as significant for understanding the Coeus legacy. She was desired by Zeus, as Leto was desired by Zeus. But where Leto accepted Zeus and became the mother of Apollo and Artemis, Asteria refused him. She transformed herself into a quail to escape his pursuit, then threw herself into the sea to escape him further, becoming the floating island that would later become Delos when it accepted Leto. The mythology thus made Asteria the island itself, made the starry Titaness the ground of the greatest birth in the Titan Olympian genealogy, the precondition of Apollo and Artemis's entry into the world. She refused Zeus and became the rock. Leto accepted Zeus and gave birth on that rock. The two daughters of Coeus and Phoebe together constituted the complete story of Apollo and Artemis's birth, Asteria as the island and Leto as the mother, the starry refusal and the gentle acceptance, both necessary for the twin divine births. Asteria's association with falling stars, with the nocturnal oracular tradition, with the divination that came from watching the stars rather than from consulting the Delphic oracle, was another expression of the Coeus principle in a different mode. Asteria's inquiry was nocturnal, based on the stars rather than the sun, on the night sky's cryptic patterns rather than the daylight's rational clarity. She represented the inquiring intelligence in its nocturnal, dreaming, star-watching mode. The inquiry that operated in the darkness rather than in the light, that found its oracular knowledge in the movements of the stars across the night sky. Together, Leto and Asteria expressed the full range of the Coeus principle. Leto, the daytime inquiry, the gentle reaching toward the divine children who would illuminate the world. Asteria, the nighttime inquiry, the starry oracle who sought knowledge in the darkness and eventually became the island where the light was born. The Titanomachy and Confinement. Part 3. The War and its Consequences. Chapter 11. Coeus in the Conflict. The Titanomachy, the great war between the Titans and the Olympians that reorganized the divine order, presented Coeus with the situation that most of the Titans faced. The choice, or more precisely the non-choice, of being counted among those who stood with Cronus, or among those who stood aside or against. The mythology is sparse about Coeus's specific role in the Titanomachy. Unlike some Titans, Atlas, who was punished with the specific task of holding the sky, Prometheus, who conspicuously sided with Zeus, and whose story was one of the mythology's most developed, Coeus does not appear as an active agent in the war's narrative. He is among the Titans who were defeated and confined in Tartarus, but the specific nature of his participation in the conflict, if any, is not recorded in the surviving sources with any specificity. What can be said is that the principle he represented, the inquiring intelligence, was not, by its nature, well suited to the kind of conflict the Titanomachy was. War was the domain of force and strategy, of the will to dominate and the capacity to overwhelm. The inquiring mind was oriented toward the unknown in a different mode, toward understanding, toward the illumination that arrived when the question found its answer, toward the knowledge that came from patient reaching, toward what was not yet known. There was no oracle to consult about the war's outcome, or if there was, neither side appears to have consulted it successfully. There was no inquiry that could resolve what was ultimately resolved by force. The thunderbolt and the 100-armed giant's overwhelming physical power. The Coeus principle, the question reaching toward the answer, was not operative in the context of the Titanomachy, in the way that it was operative in the context of Delphi. This structural incompatibility between the inquiring mind and the conflict that determined the world's governance arrangement was itself significant. The most important transition in the mythology's history was decided by the principle that was least connected to Coeus's domain. The war decided everything, and the war was decided by everything except the inquiry. Chapter 12. The Confinement. With the Titanomachy's conclusion, Coeus was confined in Tartarus, in the absolute depth of the cosmos, the place furthest from the above, furthest from the light, furthest from the inquiry's proper orientation toward the not yet known. This confinement was the mythology's most explicit expression of the tension between the Coeus principle and the organized divine order. The inquiring intelligence, the orientation of mind toward the unknown, was placed in the darkest and most enclosed of all possible spaces, the space where the unknown was the surrounding walls, rather than the horizon being approached. There is something philosophically precise about this punishment, even if the mythology did not intend it as philosophical analysis. The inquiring mind was placed in the condition of its own principle, but in its most extreme and most uncomfortable form, surrounded by the unknown rather than oriented toward it, unable to inquire because there was nowhere to inquire from, no direction from which the light could come that the inquiry was reaching toward. Tartarus was the inquiry's hell, not the hell of knowing too little, but the hell of being unable to inquire. The enclosed, the dark, the absolute below. These were the conditions in which the inquiring intelligence could not function, not because there was nothing to inquire about, but because the conditions for inquiry, the orientation toward the not yet known, the possibility of reaching toward it, were suspended by the total enclosure. The confinement of Coeus in Tartarus was the confinement of the question in the place where questions could not be asked. Chapter 13. What the confinement preserved. And yet, the confinement in Tartarus did not end the inquiry. The principle that Coeus represented, the orientation of the intelligence toward the unknown, continued in the world because the world continued to contain beings who inquired. His grandchildren were Apollo and Artemis. Apollo, born in the flooding golden light on Delos, became the god who answered the inquiries of the ancient world through the Delphic oracle, the divine intelligence that received the questions of kings and cities and private individuals and gave answers, however cryptic, however requiring interpretation, however demanding the further inquiry that would make the answer useful. The oracle presupposed the inquiry. Apollo, as the answer god, presupposed the Coeus principle as the asking god. Artemis, born first and then serving as the helper in her brother's birth, became the goddess of the wild and the hunt and the moon, the divine intelligence that moved through the darkness and the unknown spaces of the world with the certainty of the hunter who knows where the quarry will be, the goddess who combined the nocturnal quality of her aunt Asteria with the purpose and direction of the inquiry that her grandfather Coeus had embodied. Both grandchildren were, in their divine natures, expressions of what Coeus had been as a cosmic principle, the orientation of the intelligence toward what was not yet illuminated, the capacity to move through the unknown with direction and purpose, rather than with helpless bewilderment. The confinement of the principle did not extinguish the principle. It continued in its expressions, in the children and grandchildren who embodied it in specific, vivid, narratively developed divine forms. Coeus confined in Tartarus, Apollo shining on Delphi, the inquiry imprisoned and the oracle answering. The two were not in contradiction, but in a relationship that expressed the mythology's deepest understanding of how principles persisted through the limitation of the beings who most directly embodied them. Chapter 14. The Tradition of the Attempted Escape. One of the most interesting and most obscure fragments of Coeus's mythology involved a tradition preserved in only a few ancient sources, the attempt of Coeus to escape from Tartarus after the Titanomachy. The source for this tradition was the Roman writer Hyginus, whose fabulae preserved mythological material that in some cases represented traditions no longer extant in Greek sources, and whose account included the detail that Coeus had attempted to break free of his confinement in Tartarus, but had been restrained by Cerberus, the three-headed guardian of the underworld's gate. This attempted escape, if we take it seriously as a mythological tradition rather than a late invention, was one of the most philosophically significant episodes in Coeus's entire mythology, for what it said about the nature of the inquiring intelligence in confinement. The inquiring mind could not remain still. This was the deepest expression of its nature. The orientation toward the unknown was not something that could be suspended indefinitely, not something that could be confined without the confined being attempting to break free toward the horizon it was constitutionally oriented toward. The inquiry had to reach. The reaching could not be permanently stopped, even by the most severe of confinements. Cerberus stopped him. The guardian of the threshold between the underworld and the world above, the boundary between the confined and the free, between the darkness of Tartarus and whatever lay beyond it, prevented the inquiry from reaching its destination. But the attempt itself was significant. The inquiring intelligence, even in the most extreme of confinements, oriented itself toward escape, toward the light, toward the unknown that lay beyond the walls of its imprisonment. It asked, "What is beyond this?" It reached toward the not yet known. It failed to arrive, but it reached. This was the Coeus principle in its most poignant and most essential expression, the inquiry that continued even when the conditions for inquiry were suppressed, the reaching that persisted even when the reaching was blocked, the orientation toward the unknown that could not be extinguished even by the darkness of the absolute below. Part 4. The Legacy in Apollo. Chapter 15. The Oracle at Delphi. The Oracle at Delphi was the most important religious institution in the ancient Greek world, and its theological lineage ran directly through Coeus and Phoebe. Delphi was, first, the omphalos, the navel of the world, the sacred stone that marked the center of the cosmos, the point from which all other points were defined in relation. To be at Delphi was to be at the center, and at the center, at the omphalos, was the oracle, the Pythia, the woman who sat above the sacred fissure and breathed the vapors that arose from it, who entered the altered state that allowed the divine voice to speak through her, who gave answers to the questions that those who made the pilgrimage to Delphi had come to ask. The Pythia answered questions. She was the institutionalization of the Coeus principle at the center of the Greek world, the place where questions were asked and answers were given, where the inquiry arrived at the oracle, and the oracle attempted to resolve the inquiry. The entire institution presupposed the reality and the legitimacy of the question, presupposed that there were things humans did not know and needed to know, that the unknown was real, and that the inquiry directed at the unknown was the appropriate response to it. Apollo governed the oracle, but Phoebe, Coeus's wife, had governed it before Apollo, had received it from Themis, and held it for the divine generation before Apollo's birth. And behind Phoebe, grounding her bright oracular intelligence, was the reaching principle of the inquiry itself, Coeus, the divine being whose name meant the questioning intelligence, the grandfather of the oracle's final and most developed divine custodian. Every question ever asked at Delphi was, at the deepest mythological level, an expression of the Coeus principle, the human orientation toward what was not yet known, seeking the divine illumination that would bring the unknown into the known. Every Pythic answer was, in the same mythological logic, an expression of the Phoebe to Apollo tradition, the bright intelligence that the inquiry arrived at when it found its oracle. The oracle was the Coeus principle, institutionalized. Chapter 16. Apollo's Rational Light. Apollo was the god of reason, not reason as the dry faculty of logical deduction, but reason as the illuminating quality that made previously obscure things visible, the divine intelligence that brought the hidden into the open, the light of the rational mind that corresponded to and expressed the light of the physical sun. This rational light, the light of Apollo's capacity to illuminate what had been dark, was the specific Olympian expression of the Coeus principle's completion. The inquiry, reaching toward the not yet known, arrived at a destination, the illumination of what had been unknown, the making visible of what had been dark, the resolution of the question in the brightness of the answer. Apollo's reason was not merely logical. It was aesthetic, musical, poetic. The divine intelligence expressed not only in the precision of the oracle's answer, but in the beauty of the music that ordered the cosmos, the harmony of the mathematical ratios that expressed the world's deepest structure, the clarity of the poetic form that made truth transmissible from the divine to the human. This combination, reason and beauty, logic and music, the precise and the aesthetic, was the Olympian elaboration of what the Titan grandparents had represented in simpler form. Coeus was the inquiry, the reaching. Phoebe was the bright knowing. Apollo was what the reaching and the bright knowing looked like when they were fully developed, fully organized, fully expressed in the divine being who was their most complete manifestation. He was the Coeus principle at its arrival, the inquiry that had found its answer, the reaching that had reached its destination, the orientation toward the unknown that had arrived at the known and expressed the known, in the beauty of the musical harmony and the precision of the oracle's response. Chapter 17. Apollo and the Python. One of Apollo's most significant mythological acts was the killing of the Python, the great serpent that had guarded the Delphic oracle before Apollo claimed it, the primordial creature of the earth that represented the older, chthonic, pre-rational oracle that Apollo's rational light superseded. The Python was a creature of the earth, of Gaia, the oldest wisdom, the first holder of the Delphic oracle. It was ancient, powerful, associated with the darkness and the depths, with the prophetic voice that came from the earth's own interior, rather than from the rational divine intelligence above. Apollo killed it. He arrived at Delphi as a young god and slew the Python with his arrows, establishing his own rational, solar oracle in the place of the earth oracle that the Python had guarded. This act of divine conquest, the rational above light killing the chthonic earth creature, was the mythology's account of the transition from the older, more mysterious, earth-based oracular tradition to the more organized, more rational, more Apollo-organized prophetic tradition that Delphi would represent in historical practice. The transition was the specific narrative in which Phoebe passed her oracle to Apollo, in which the titanic bright intelligence gave way to the Olympian rational light, in which the grandmother's wisdom was superseded by the grandson's more organized and more fully developed version of the same essential capacity. And behind this entire transition, behind the Python, behind Phoebe, behind Apollo, was the Coeus principle, the inquiry that drove the whole development, the asking that made the oracle necessary, the orientation toward the unknown that the oracle served to address. The Python had guarded the inquiry's answer before Apollo organized it more completely. Apollo's killing of the Python and claiming of the oracle was the inquiry's most successful institutionalization, the reaching toward the unknown, arriving at the most developed and most sophisticated of all the ancient world's oracular institutions. Chapter 18. Artemis and the Unknown Wild. Artemis, Apollo's twin, Coeus's granddaughter through Leto, expressed the Coeus principle in a very different mode, the mode of the hunter in the unknown wild, the divine intelligence that moved through the darkness and the unmapped spaces with the purpose and direction of the one who knew where the quarry was. Hunting was the pursuit of the unknown quarry, the movement through unfamiliar territory in search of what was not yet located, the orientation of the intelligence and the body toward what had not yet been found. The hunt was the inquiry in its most physical and most visceral expression, not the abstract reaching of the questioning mind toward the not yet known, but the concrete, embodied, moving through the actual darkness, reaching of the hunter toward the not yet located prey. Artemis was the divine intelligence of this physical inquiry. She moved through the wilderness, the unmapped, uncultivated, unclaimed spaces that were, in the Greek imaginative geography, the spaces where civilization's knowledge gave out and the genuine unknown began. She moved through these spaces with authority, with purpose, with the certainty of the hunter who did not know exactly where the quarry was, but knew the quarry was there and knew how to find it. This was the Coeus principle in its wild form, not the organized inquiry of the oracle, not the rational illumination of the Delphic question and answer, but the embodied inquiry of the hunt, the moving toward the unknown that expressed itself in the body's movement through the unknown space, rather than in the mind's reaching toward the unknown truth. Artemis was the granddaughter who expressed the grand paternal principle in the mode of the body, the wilderness, the physical pursuit of the not yet found. The philosophical depth. Part 5. The Inquiry as Principle. Chapter 19. What Inquiry Was. The inquiry, the orientation of the intelligence toward what it does not yet know, was one of the most fundamental acts that human beings performed, and the Greek tradition's choice to make it the domain of a Titan, rather than treating it as simply a human capacity, expressed something important about how that tradition understood the status of the questioning mind. By making Coeus a Titan, by making the inquiring intelligence a divine cosmic principle rather than merely a human faculty, the Greek tradition was making a claim about the nature of the inquiry itself. It was not merely a psychological process that happened to occur in certain kinds of minds. It was a feature of the cosmos, a principle of the world's structure, a divine reality as fundamental as the world river, or the above light, or the divine law. The cosmos was organized in such a way that intelligence, when it arose in it, was oriented toward the unknown. This was not contingent, not something that might have been otherwise if the world had been organized differently. It was necessary, was built into the structure of consciousness itself, was the fundamental character of mind as mind, rather than as passive recording device. The inquiry was cosmic in this sense. Wherever mind existed, mind was oriented toward what it did not yet know. Wherever consciousness arose, consciousness reached toward what it had not yet reached. The inquiry was not merely something that some humans did sometimes. It was what mind was, at the most fundamental level, always already doing. This cosmological understanding of the inquiry, expressed mythologically through Coeus' status as a titan, a cosmic principle, a fundamental feature of the world's divine organization, was one of the Greek tradition's most significant contributions to the intellectual tradition that succeeded it. Chapter 20: Socrates and the Examined Life. The figure who was, in historical terms, the most complete expression of the Coeus principle in the Greek philosophical tradition was Socrates, the philosopher who went to the Delphic oracle, received the pronouncement that he was the wisest of men, and devoted the rest of his life to inquiring into what this could possibly mean. The Socratic story was, in mythological terms, a direct encounter with the Coeus to Apollo lineage. The philosopher went to the oracle, Apollo's institution, Phoebe's inheritance, the institutionalized expression of the Coeus principle, and received an answer that immediately generated more questions. The oracle answered that Socrates was wisest. Socrates' inquiry into this answer, what could it mean that he was wisest when he knew nothing, became the entire subsequent philosophical tradition associated with him. The inquiry was self-reflexive, the Coeus principle applied to itself. The questioning intelligence asked what it was to be the questioning intelligence. The inquiry inquired into the inquiry, and what Socrates found, through this sustained self-application of the questioning mind to its own condition, was the famous Socratic ignorance, the awareness that he did not know, that the awareness of not knowing was itself a form of wisdom, that the inquiry that began with the recognition of ignorance was more genuinely intelligent than the confidence that never recognized its own limits. This Socratic recognition, that the most genuine intelligence was the intelligence that knew its own ignorance, that the deepest wisdom was the wisdom that recognized how much was not yet known, was the philosophical development of the Coeus principle at its most sophisticated. The divine being of the inquiring mind at the deepest level was not the being of the answer, but the being of the question. And the question was most genuine, most genuinely inquiry, when it was most thoroughly aware that it was a question and not yet an answer. The apology, Socrates' defense at his trial, was the most complete expression of this Coeus Socratic principle in the ancient philosophical literature. The inquiry justifying itself, the questioning mind explaining why the questioning mind was worth preserving, the divine human expression of the Titan principle, defending its own existence before those who would suppress it. Chapter 21. Aristotle's First Philosophy. Where Socrates expressed the Coeus principle in its most personal and most dramatically ironic form, the inquiry that arrived at the knowledge of ignorance, Aristotle expressed it in its most comprehensive and most organized form. The opening sentence of Aristotle's Metaphysics was one of the most famous in the history of philosophy. All men by nature desire to know. This was not a casual observation. It was a metaphysical claim about the nature of human consciousness, about what mind was at its most fundamental level. The desire to know, the orientation of the intelligence toward what it did not yet know, the reaching of the inquiring mind toward the not yet understood, was, for Aristotle, not a contingent preference that some people had and others lacked. It was the natural condition of mind as mind. What it was to be a conscious being was, among other things, to be constitutionally oriented toward knowledge that one did not yet possess. This was the Coeus principle in philosophical vocabulary. The Titan of the inquiring mind, the divine being whose name connected to the perceiving, questioning intelligence, was, in Aristotle's Metaphysics, the fundamental orientation of all conscious life. The desire to know, the reaching toward what was not yet known, the constitutional intellectual restlessness that the fully flourishing human being expressed in the systematic pursuit of understanding. Aristotle's Metaphysics as a whole was the Coeus principle at its most systematic, the inquiry organized into a comprehensive investigation of the most fundamental questions. What was being? What was substance? What was the first cause of all things? What was the divine? Questions that no one before had asked with quite this systematic comprehensiveness, or pursued with quite this patient, methodical rigor. The god of questions had in Aristotle his most complete philosophical expression. Not the individual inquirer examining particular things, but the comprehensive system of inquiry, examining the most fundamental things, asking the questions that had never been fully asked before, reaching toward the not yet known at the most fundamental level of reality. Chapter 22. The Presocratic Tradition. Before Socrates and Aristotle, the Presocratic philosophers, the thinkers who preceded Socrates, and who are usually considered the founders of the Western philosophical tradition, were engaged in an enterprise that was, in its fundamental character, a sustained expression of the Coeus principle. They asked, what is everything made of? What is the fundamental principle of all things? Why is there something rather than nothing? What is the relationship between the apparent diversity of the world and the unity that underlies it? These were questions that had not been asked before in the same way, not as questions directed at a naturalistic rather than mythological account of the world, not as questions that expected an answer in terms of principles and processes rather than in terms of divine beings and their activities. They were the Coeus principle applied to the natural world, the inquiring intelligence oriented toward the fundamental unknown of what the world was at its deepest level. Thales asking whether water was the fundamental principle, Anaximander asking whether the fundamental principle was the unlimited, the indefinite, Anaximenes asking whether it was air, Heraclitus asking whether it was fire and flux, Parmenides asking whether being itself was one and unchanging, Democritus asking whether the fundamental units were atoms in a void. Each of these was the inquiry taking a different form, reaching toward the same fundamental unknown from a different angle, expressing the same basic Coeus orientation, the reaching of the intelligence toward the not yet known at the most fundamental level, in a different philosophical vocabulary. The pre-Socratic tradition as a whole was the Coeus principle at work in the first systematic mode. The inquiring intelligence turned on the world's most fundamental character, refusing the mythological answers that had been available and reaching instead toward the more precise, more demanding, more genuinely inquiry-based philosophical answers that the tradition would eventually develop. Chapter 23. The Allegory of the Cave Reconsidered. Plato's Allegory of the Cave, which appeared in our account of Hyperion as the philosophical development of the above-light principle, was also, from a different angle, the philosophical development of the Coeus principle, the allegory of the inquiry itself. The prisoners in the cave were not merely in darkness, they were in the condition of the non-inquiring mind. They had been chained since birth in such a position that they could only see the shadows on the wall, and they had taken these shadows for reality. They had not inquired. They had received what the position gave them, the shadows, and had assumed that what they received was the totality of the real. The philosopher's journey was not only the journey from dark to light, it was the journey of the inquiry, the reaching of the mind that had decided to orient itself toward the not yet known, rather than to remain in the comfort of the apparently known. The prisoner who turned from the shadows toward the fire, who left the cave and turned toward the sun. This prisoner was expressing the Coeus principle in Plato's most vivid philosophical image. The turn itself, the moment when the chained mind decided to face a different direction, to orient itself toward the unknown rather than remaining fixed on the familiar shadows, was the foundational moment of the philosophical life, and, in mythological terms, the expression of what Coeus embodied as a cosmic principle. The inquiry began with the turn, with the reorientation of the mind from what it was comfortable with toward what it did not yet know. Plato's cave was the Coeus principle in its most extended philosophical form, the allegory not only of the above light, which arrived at the end of the journey when the philosopher stood in the sunlight, but of the inquiry, which was the journey itself, from the cave to the light, from the comfortable familiar to the demanding unknown. Part 6. Coeus and the Tradition of Questions. Chapter 24. The Socratic Method. The Socratic method, elenchus, the cross-examination that Socrates practiced in the dialogues that Plato recorded, was the most formally developed expression of the Coeus principle in the ancient philosophical tradition, a method whose entire structure was the inquiry itself, the systematic questioning of what the interlocutor believed they knew, in order to arrive at the honest acknowledgement of what was not yet known. Socrates would begin with a question. What is courage? What is piety? What is justice? These were questions directed at the fundamental concepts that organized the moral and political life of the Athenian citizen. Questions whose answers most people assumed they knew, but had never examined. The Socratic method was the examination, the sustained, rigorous application of the inquiring intelligence to the beliefs that most people held without having subjected them to inquiry. The examination typically arrived at the same place. The interlocutor discovered that they did not know what they had thought they knew, that the concept they had been using without examination could not withstand the examination, that the confident answer with which they had begun the conversation dissolved into perplexity under the pressure of the sustained questioning. This perplexity, aporia, the state of being at an impasse, unable to proceed in the direction one had been going, was the Socratic method's characteristic conclusion. And Socrates treated it not as failure, but as success. The interlocutor who arrived at genuine aporia had progressed, had moved from the false certainty of the unexamined belief to the genuine uncertainty of the examined and found wanting, had crossed from the shadow world of the assumed known to the honest condition of the not yet known. The Coeus principle led in Socrates to aporia. The inquiry arrived at the honest recognition of the inquiry's incompleteness. The reaching toward the not yet known arrived at the cleaner, more honest condition of the acknowledged not yet known. This was not the ending of the inquiry. It was the beginning of it. The genuine beginning. The beginning after the false beginning of the unexamined assumption had been cleared away. Chapter 25. The question as gift. There was a dimension of the Coeus principle that the philosophical tradition tended to underemphasize in its focus on the inquiry as a means toward knowledge. The question as gift in itself, the inquiry as valuable in its own right, regardless of whether it arrived at the answer. The question opened something. When a genuine question was asked, not the rhetorical question that already knew its answer, not the question as challenge designed to demonstrate the questioner's knowledge rather than to seek what was not yet known, but the genuine question that expressed real orientation toward the not yet known. It opened a space in the conversation, in the thinking, in the understanding, that the answer, if it came, would eventually fill. This opening was itself valuable. The space opened by the genuine question was the space in which thinking could occur, the space that the assumption closed off, that the confident believer's certainty precluded, that only the honest acknowledgement of the not yet known could create. Coeus, as the divine principle of the inquiry, was, in this reading, the God of the opening, the divine being who created the space in which the bright knowing of Phoebe and the oracle of Apollo and the philosophical illumination of the tradition that descended from the Delphic institution could eventually fill. He created the space. His children and grandchildren filled it. He was the emptying that made the filling possible, the questioning that made the answering possible, the not yet known that made the eventually known arrive with the quality of revelation rather than merely the quality of the obvious. Every question was, at the deepest mythological level, a gift of Coeus, the opening of the space that the answer would eventually fill, the honest acknowledgement of the not yet known that was the precondition of the genuine knowing. Chapter 26. The axis of the inquiry. Returning to Coeus's cosmological association with the world axis, the pole around which the celestial sphere rotated, the stable center relative to which all the cosmic motion was organized, we can now understand this association in its deepest implication. The axis was the stable orientation, not the fixed point that refused to move. The axis itself rotated with the celestial sphere, participated in the cosmic motion, but the stable direction around which the motion was organized, the vector that gave the motion its structure, rather than allowing it to be random, spinning without pattern. The inquiry was this kind of axis, not a fixed belief, not a stable certainty, but a stable orientation, the consistent pointing of the intelligence toward the not yet known, the directional stability that gave the intellectual life its structure, rather than allowing it to be random reception of stimuli without pattern. Coeus as the axis was, Coeus as the stable intellectual direction, the consistent orientation of the inquiring mind toward what it did not yet know, the axial constancy that made the accumulation and organization of knowledge possible, rather than merely the random possession of isolated facts. This was the deepest expression of his cosmological significance. Not merely that questions were asked, but that the asking had direction, had the axial stability that organized the intellectual life around a consistent orientation toward the unknown. The Coeus principle was the axis of the intellectual cosmos, the stable direction around which the entire enterprise of human knowing was organized. The Descendants. Part 7. Apollo's Children and the Extended Legacy. Chapter 27. The Muses and their Grandfather's Principle. The Muses, the 9 goddesses of the arts and sciences, daughters of Zeus and Mnemosyne, memory, the divine beings who inspired the poets and musicians and philosophers and historians of the ancient world, were not, genealogically, Coeus's grandchildren. They descended from Mnemosyne, the titaness of memory, not from Coeus, the titan of inquiry. But the Muses' domain was, functionally, the domain of the Coeus principle in its most developed cultural expressions. Poetry was the reaching of the imagination toward the beauty of what it could not yet articulate. Music was the reaching of the hearing intelligence toward the harmonic order that it sensed but could not see. Philosophy was the reaching of the reasoning mind toward the truths it did not yet possess. History was the reaching of the inquiring memory toward the past that was not yet fully recovered. Each of these muse-inspired activities was the Coeus principle in a specific cultural mode. And the Muses, as the divine beings who inspired these activities, were, in functional terms, if not in genealogical terms, the expressions of the same divine principle that Coeus had embodied at the cosmic level. The artistic and intellectual tradition that the Muses governed was the tradition of the Coeus principle's most elaborate and most beautiful expressions. The reaching of the human intelligence toward what was not yet known, or not yet said, or not yet created, expressed in the specific forms of poetry and music and philosophy and history, and all the other disciplines that the Muse tradition encompassed. Chapter 28. Leto's Children and the Question's Answer. Apollo and Artemis, the twin divine children of Coeus's daughter Leto, were together the most complete mythological expression of the inquiry's relationship to its answer. Apollo was the answer, the oracle, the rational light, the divine intelligence that received the questions and gave answers, however cryptic, that at least gestured toward the illumination the inquiry was reaching for. He was the Phoebe principle carried to its Olympian completion, the bright knowing that was the oracular answer to the inquiring reaching. Artemis was the question in its embodied form, the hunter in the wild, the divine intelligence that moved through the unmapped spaces with the orientation of the inquiry, not yet arrived at the quarry, but knowing the quarry was there, moving through the darkness with the purposeful direction of the one who was reaching toward what was not yet found. Together they constituted the complete arc, the reaching question, Artemis moving through the wild, and the arriving answer, Apollo's oracle. Coeus's grandchildren were the question and the answer, the twin expressions of the inquiry in its two fundamental phases. This was the mythology's most elegant structural expression of the Coeus principle. The grandchildren were the inquiry's own two moments, the reaching and the arriving, the hunter and the oracle, the movement through the dark and the flooding golden light. Chapter 29. The Delphic Maxims. The oracle at Delphi was the institution of the Coeus principle in its most organized and most culturally significant form, and the maxims inscribed on the temple of Apollo at Delphi were the oracular wisdom tradition's most concentrated expressions. The most famous, know thyself, gnoti siauton. This maxim was the Coeus principle applied to the self. The inquiry turned inward, the questioning intelligence oriented not toward the external unknown, but toward the internal unknown, the reaches of the self that had not yet been examined, the depths of one's own character and motivation and understanding that remained, for most people, largely unexplored. Know thyself was the Delphic oracle's most fundamental instruction for the inquiring mind. Before reaching toward the external unknown, reach toward the internal unknown. Before asking what the world was, ask what you were. Before seeking the oracle's answer to your questions, examine whether you had asked the right questions, which required knowing yourself well enough to know what you truly sought. The maxim was also, in its deeper implications, the oracle's acknowledgement of the limits of the oracle's own utility. What the Pythia could give you was an answer, but whether you could use the answer depended on whether you knew yourself well enough to apply it correctly. The oracle presupposed the self-knowledge of the questioner. Without this self-knowledge, the answer would be misapplied, misinterpreted, or simply missed. Know thyself was Coeus's instruction to his oracle's petitioners. Inquire first into yourself. The inquiry that would arrive at the most genuinely useful answers was the inquiry that had first taken itself as its object, the questioning intelligence that had examined its own nature, its own motivations, its own biases and limitations, and genuine desires before turning its inquiry outward. The second great Delphic maxim, nothing in excess, was the inquiry's companion. Not only know yourself, but maintain the balance that the knowing revealed as appropriate. The excessive, the immoderate, the reaching beyond the proper measure, was the violation of the divine order that Nemesis addressed. The inquiry, properly conducted, arrived at knowledge of the appropriate measure. including the knowledge of the appropriate measure of the inquiry itself. Chapter 30. The Pythagorean Tradition. Pythagoras and the tradition associated with him, the mathematical, philosophical, religious movement that emerged in the Greek world of the 6th century BCE, and that had enormous influence on the subsequent philosophical tradition, particularly through its influence on Plato, was another significant expression of the Coeus principle in the philosophical mode. The Pythagoreans were fundamentally inquirers into mathematical structure, into the discovery that the world's most fundamental regularities were expressible in mathematical ratios, that the harmony of the music and the harmony of the cosmos were expressions of the same mathematical relationships, that the not yet known could be approached through the precise language of number and ratio and geometric form. The discovery of the mathematical structure of the musical octave, that the ratio 2:1, when expressed as a string length, produced an octave, that 3:2 produced a fifth, that 4:3 produced a fourth, was the Pythagorean inquiry arriving at an answer of extraordinary beauty. The harmony that the ear found pleasing was the expression of the mathematical harmony that the intellect found true. This discovery, that the sensory world's most immediately beautiful phenomenon, musical harmony, was also the expression of the intellect's most purely formal structure, mathematical ratio, was the most complete early expression of the Coeus to Apollo principle in the philosophical mode. The inquiry reaching toward the unknown arrived at the illumination that was simultaneously rational and beautiful, that expressed the same divine order in both the intellectual and the aesthetic dimensions. Apollo's music, the god of the rational light, was also the god of the musical harmony, the divine being who ordered both the cosmos and the music with the same mathematical precision, was the mythological expression of the same truth that the Pythagoreans were discovering through their philosophical inquiry, that the world's beauty and the world's rationality were not separate dimensions, but expressions of the same underlying mathematical divine order. The Continuing Inquiry. Part 8. What the Question Was. Chapter 31. The Structure of the Genuine Question. There was, in the philosophical tradition that the Coeus principle had grounded, an important distinction between the genuine question and the merely apparent question, between the inquiry that expressed a real orientation toward the not yet known and the pseudo-inquiry that was organized around what was already assumed to be known. The genuine question was genuinely open. The questioner did not know the answer and was genuinely reaching toward it. The genuine question created the space in which the answer could arrive as a genuine illumination rather than as a confirmation of what was already assumed. The pseudo-question was already closed. The questioner knew, or thought they knew, the answer, and was asking the question as a rhetorical demonstration of their knowledge, or as a challenge designed to expose the other's ignorance, or as a way of directing the inquiry toward the answer they already had, rather than toward the answer the inquiry might actually find. The distinction was not always visible from the outside. Pseudo-questions could look exactly like genuine questions, but the Coeus principle, properly understood, required the genuine question, the actual orientation of the intelligence toward what it did not yet know, the real emptiness that the answer would eventually fill, rather than the pseudo-emptiness of the already answered, but not yet displayed. The Delphic oracle could only answer genuine questions. The pseudo-question, the question asked by someone who already knew what answer they wanted and was seeking the oracle's confirmation, would receive an answer. But the answer would be, characteristically, one that the questioner would misinterpret through the filter of their prior certainty, arriving at a catastrophic confirmation of what they had already assumed when the oracle had in fact said something quite different. The story of Coeus, who asked the oracle whether he should attack Persia and received the answer that a great empire would fall if he did, interpreted this as confirmation that Persia would fall, but discovered it meant his own empire, was the mythology of the pseudo-question's failure. The questioner who already knew the answer he wanted, who heard the oracle's response through the filter of what he assumed, rather than through the opening of genuine inquiry, who was destroyed by his own certainty. The Coeus principle demanded the genuine question. The genuine question demanded genuine openness. Genuine openness was the most demanding and most important of the intellectual virtues. Chapter 32. The question that cannot be answered. The philosophical tradition also recognized a specific class of questions that were genuine, that expressed real orientation toward the not yet known, but that might not, even in principle, have answers available to human intelligence. What happened before the universe began? What was it like to be a different kind of conscious being? What would have happened if history had taken a different turn? What was the nature of the divine in itself? Not as it expressed itself in the world, but as it was in its own most fundamental character. These were questions that the Coeus principle generated, genuine inquiries, real orientations of the intelligence toward what it did not know. But that might exceed the capacity of any finite intelligence to answer, with the finality that the question's form suggested it deserved. The philosophical traditions that confronted these questions developed different responses to their unanswerability. Plato's forms suggested that the highest realities were in principle knowable, but required the philosophical assent to approach. The Neoplatonic tradition suggested that the highest principle, the One, was genuinely beyond all description and all knowing, could only be approached asymptotically through the mystical assent. The skeptical tradition suggested that the most fundamental questions about the world's ultimate nature were genuinely unanswerable, and that the appropriate response was suspension of judgment. Coeus, as the divine principle of the inquiry, encompassed all of these responses. The reaching toward the not yet known was valid whether or not the not yet known was ultimately reachable. The inquiry was legitimate in itself, not only as a means to the answer. The reaching was real, even when the destination exceeded the reach. This was the deepest dignity of the Coeus principle. The inquiry was not invalidated by its incompleteness, not rendered worthless by its failure to arrive at the final answer. The reaching was the value. The orientation was the virtue. The genuine question was the expression of the divine that was available to finite intelligence, even when the divine's final nature exceeded all the finite intelligence's capacities. Chapter 33. The Inquiry in Modern Science. Modern science was, in its deepest character, the most systematic and most successful institutionalization of the Coeus principle in the history of human civilization. The organized, collective, self-correcting inquiry into the not yet known, the reaching of the human intelligence toward what it did not yet understand about the world, conducted through the specific methods of hypothesis, experiment, observation, and revision. Every scientific hypothesis was a question in disguised form. The hypothesis that the world behaved in a certain way was the inquiry into whether it did. Every experiment was the question put to the world directly, the inquiry's most demanding form. Not what do I believe, but what is actually the case. Every observation was the attempt to let the world answer the question, rather than letting prior assumption determine what the answer would be. The self-correcting character of science, the insistence on revising hypotheses in response to contradicting evidence, the willingness to abandon previous conclusions when better evidence required it, was the Coeus principle's most rigorous expression. The genuine openness to what the inquiry revealed, the refusal to protect prior certainties from the pressure of genuine evidence. The scientific method was, in this analysis, the institutionalization of what the Delphic oracle had attempted to institutionalize in the ancient world. The formal system for receiving and responding to the inquiry, the organized mechanism for connecting the human, reaching toward the unknown with the divine, or in the modern mode, the natural, illumination that revealed what had been dark. From Coeus to Phoebe to Apollo, to the oracle at Delphi, to Socrates, to Aristotle, to the philosophical tradition, to the scientific revolution, to the modern research institution. A continuous thread, the Coeus principle developing and elaborating itself across the centuries of the intellectual tradition that the ancient mythological imagination had grounded in the divine. Chapter 34. The Living Question. What made the Coeus principle permanent? What made it as genuinely present in the contemporary world as in the ancient world that gave it divine form? Was the simple fact that the inquiry was still occurring. Questions were still being asked. Questions that had never been asked before were being discovered. Questions about the quantum nature of matter, about the structure of the genome, about the neural basis of consciousness, about the mathematical structure of the universe at its most fundamental level. And questions that had been asked since the beginning of the philosophical tradition were still being asked, still unanswered in the full sense, still generating the reaching of the intelligence toward what it did not yet know. What is the good life? What is justice? What is the relationship between mind and body? What grounds moral obligation? What makes something beautiful? These were Coeus's questions. The questions that the inquiring intelligence had been asking since before Socrates, that Socrates had sharpened and illuminated, that the philosophical tradition had developed through successive generations, and that remained genuinely open, still requiring the inquiry's continued reaching. The Coeus principle was alive wherever a genuine question was asked. It was alive in the physicist asking what happened in the first moments of the universe. It was alive in the moral philosopher, asking what grounded the distinction between right and wrong. It was alive in the artist asking what form could adequately express what needed to be expressed. It was alive in the child asking why the sky was blue. Wherever the intelligence oriented itself toward what it did not yet know, wherever the genuine question was asked, the Coeus principle was present, the ancient divine being of the inquiry, expressing itself in the specific contemporary form of the question that had not yet found its answer. Part 9. The Deepest Understanding. Chapter 35. The Question Behind the Oracle. Every answer presupposes a question. This was the logical truth that the mythological tradition had encoded in the genealogy. Coeus, the inquiry, was the grandfather of Apollo. The answer, the question, was prior to the oracle's answering. The reaching preceded the arriving. This logical priority was also an existential priority. The question was not merely temporally prior to the answer, not merely the first step in a sequence that the answer completed. The question was the opening within which the answer had its meaning. Without the question, the answer was not an answer. It was just a statement, one among the many possible statements that the world contained, without the specific significance of being the response to the reaching that had been seeking it. The oracle's answers meant what they meant because people had questions they had brought to Delphi. The divine illumination was illumination in relation to the darkness that the question had expressed. Apollo's rational light shone in the space that Coeus's inquiry had opened. This was the deepest mythological statement about the relationship between the two. Not that the question was more important than the answer, or that the inquiry was more valuable than the knowledge it eventually arrived at, but that the question was the condition of the answer's significance, that the reaching was what made the arriving matter. Coeus was the grandfather of Apollo, but in a more profound sense, Coeus was the condition of Apollo's significance. The oracle answered because people asked. The divine light illuminated because the inquiry had created the darkness that needed illuminating. Apollo's golden flooding of Delos at his birth was the answer to the question that Leto's wandering had embodied. Where could the new divine life enter the world? The question was the wandering. The answer was the light. Chapter 36. What Coeus still is. He is still the divine principle of the question, not in any literal theological sense, not as the object of active worship, or as the being whose specific character is the subject of ongoing religious devotion, but in the more fundamental sense that the principle he represented was as real and as operative in the contemporary world as in the ancient world that gave it divine form. The reaching of the intelligence toward what it does not yet know, the orientation of the mind toward the not yet understood, the constitutive intellectual restlessness that refused to accept the apparently known as the finally known, that continued reaching beyond the last answer toward the next question. This was Coeus's domain, and it was as present and as active as it had ever been. Every scientist at the frontier of her discipline, pushing against what was not yet known, every philosopher working on the questions that the tradition had not yet resolved, every child whose why continued past the first answer toward the next, every human being who looked at the night sky and felt the reaching of the intelligence toward what was there, what it meant, what lay beyond the visible. These were the expressions of the Coeus principle in the contemporary mode. Not mythological figures, not divine beings with genealogies and cult practices, but the same fundamental orientation of consciousness toward the not yet known that the ancient tradition had recognized as divine, had given a name and a position in the cosmic order, had honored as one of the most fundamental principles of the world's structure. The inquiry was divine, not in the sense of belonging to a specific divine being who could be named and propitiated, in the sense of being among the most fundamental features of the conscious world, among the things that mind, wherever it arose, was constitutionally oriented toward. He was still there, in the question, in every genuine question, in the reaching. Chapter 37. The Invisible Grandfather. He remained, throughout the tradition, the invisible grandfather, the one whose principle was most vivid, not in his own mythology, but in the mythologies of those who came from him. This invisibility was not a failure. It was the appropriate expression of his nature. The inquiry was not itself the object of attention, was not itself what the attention was directed toward. The attention was directed toward the not yet known that the inquiry was reaching for. The inquiry was the reaching, and the reaching was defined by what it reached toward, not by itself. Coeus was invisible because the inquiry was always oriented outward, toward the oracle, toward the answer, toward the not yet known. The question did not draw attention to itself. It directed attention toward its object. The questioning intelligence did not make itself the center. It made the question's object the center. This was his appropriate invisibility. The invisible grandfather, who was the condition of everything visible that descended from him. The inquiry that was the precondition of the oracle's significance. The question that was the opening within which every answer had its meaning. He was there in the oracle's threshold. He was there in the philosopher's perplexity. He was there in the scientist's hypothesis. He was there in every genuine question ever asked. He was the divine principle of the ask. And the ask continued. Chapter 38. The Final Reaching. He was confined in Tartarus. He attempted to escape. Cerberus stopped him. The inquiry, at its most concentrated and most extreme, was the inquiry that continued even when the conditions for inquiry were most severely suppressed, that reached even when the reaching was blocked, that oriented itself toward the unknown, even from the condition of the absolute enclosed. This was the most heroic expression of the Coeus principle, and the least celebrated. Not the inquiry that arrived at the oracle's answer, not the question that found its illumination in Apollo's golden flooding, not the philosophical reaching that arrived at the Platonic form, but the inquiry that continued in the dark, that reached toward the light even from the deepest dark, that did not accept the enclosure as the permanent condition, even when Cerberus stood at the threshold. He failed to escape. The attempt was stopped, but the attempt was made. The inquiry continued, even in Tartarus. This was the Coeus principle at its most essential and most permanent. Not the inquiry that succeeded, not the reaching that arrived, not the question that found its answer, but the reaching itself. the orientation of the intelligence toward the not yet known, that persisted even when the conditions most severely suppressed it, that continued even from the absolute below. That was the most permanent and most fundamental of all the intellectual orientations, because it was what mind was before it knew anything, when it was most completely itself, in its pure condition of the reaching toward. The inquiry was what mind was before it knew anything. Coeus was the divine principle of mind in its most fundamental condition, the reaching, the asking, the orientation toward the not yet known. He is still reaching. The question is still being asked. Epilogue. The question continues. You have been asking questions your entire life, not always consciously, not always with the formality of the philosophical inquiry or the precision of the scientific hypothesis. But the basic orientation, the reaching of your intelligence toward what you did not yet know, the refusal of the apparently known as the finally known, the pulling toward the not yet understood that you have felt whenever you have been fully alive intellectually. This was Coeus's principle, expressing itself in you. Every time you have wondered about something, every time you have pushed past the first answer towards the next question, every time you have felt the peculiar human restlessness of the not yet understood, the sense that there was something more to grasp, something deeper to reach for, something the current understanding had not yet fully captured. That was Coeus, not literally, not as a divine being intervening in your intellectual life, not as a titan directing your curiosity from some external position. As the principle, the orientation of consciousness toward the not yet known, that was as present in you as it was in Socrates, asking what justice was, as it was in Aristotle cataloguing the world's phenomena, as it was in the Pythia at Delphi, receiving the god's answer through the sacred vapors. He was the grandfather you never met, whose nature you had inherited. The divine principle, whose mythological form was obscure, but whose actual expression was the most familiar thing in your intellectual life. The question. He was in the first question you ever asked. He is in the questions you are still asking. He will be in every question you have not yet thought to ask, but will. The inquiry was ancient before the Greeks gave it a name. It will continue after every name, for it has been forgotten. He is the question. The question continues. Here ends the story of Coeus, son of Uranus and Gaia, titan of the inquiring mind, husband of Phoebe, father of Leto and Asteria, grandfather of Apollo and Artemis, divine principle of the intelligence oriented toward the not yet known, the grandfather of the oracle, the question behind the answer, the reaching that preceded every arriving. He was the invisible grandfather of the most visible divine children. He was confined in Tartarus and attempted to escape. He reached toward the light even from the deepest dark. He was stopped at the threshold. But the inquiry continued. His grandchildren answered questions across the centuries. His principle was in every philosopher who reached toward the not yet known. His principle is in every question that is genuinely asked. He is the divine being of the reaching. The reaching continues. It has never stopped. it will never stop. That is Coeus. That is the question. That is the beginning